You're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon. Rolling Stone pulled no punches on this one. Here's the headline. Henry Kissinger, war criminal, beloved by America's ruling class, finally dies. The infamy of Nixon's foreign policy architect sits eternally beside that of history's worst mass murderers. A deeper shame attaches to the country that celebrates him. For insight into this, let's turn to my next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Revolting Capital Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
I posted earlier today the following. A man is judged by the deeds he does. Henry Kissinger was a henchman for empire. There's nothing noble, gallant, or statesmanlike about the policies and resulting actions of the policies he championed. He was very simply a war criminal. He was never judged and held to account by the ICC, but he's being judged by a higher court now. Your thoughts on Kissinger's passing, Dr. Horne?
Well, I could not have put it better myself. Henry Kissinger passing away at the age of 100 at his palatial estate in Kent, Connecticut. He was certainly a war criminal. Recall that he was born in Germany approximately a century ago, arrived in the United States as the Nazis were coming to power, joined the U.S. military, played a central role in intelligence and counterintelligence in the U.S. military, arrived at Harvard, where he matriculated and was catapulted into prominence when he wrote a book on so-called limited nuclear war, believe it or not. The fact that such a harebrained concept could catapult him into the front ranks of the academic elite says something very troubling and disturbing about the United States. That brought him to the attention of Governor Nelson Rockefeller of New York State, an heir to a major oil and oily fortune. As you know, Governor Rockefeller was not able to triumph in 1964 over the ultra-rightist senator from Arizona, Barry Goldwater, a man who, of course, said that extremism and the pursuit of virtue is not necessarily a vice, or something to that effect, I should say. And that brought him into the attention of Richard Nixon, who triumphed at the polls in 1968, appointed Dr. Kissinger his national security advisor, and he eventually held the position of national security advisor and secretary of state under Nixon and his successor, speaking of Gerald Ford. And during his bloodstained administration, his reign, he was an engineer of the coup in Chile, September 11th, 1973. He presided over the massacres that gave birth to the independent country of East Timor, which, of course, was in the process of being gobbled up by its neighbor, Indonesia, under military rule. After the Portuguese, the colonial power, were being forced out. I think that our audience in particular should pay attention to his rather dastardly role in Southern Africa. Recall that in 1975, Mozambique on the eastern coast of Africa surged to independence. On the west coast of Africa, you had Angola, which shortly thereafter surged to independence. Both, like East Timor, had been Portuguese colonies, and of course referred to the fact that you had the enormously profound revolution in Portugal in April 1974, which gave rise to these anti-colonial triumphs. In any case, you had apartheid South Africa, with which Mr. Kissinger was collaborating with, seeking to foil the independence of Angola in particular, and we witnessed the dispatching of Cuban troops to Angola to vouchsafe Angola's independence, and I found it extraordinary. But just the other day, you had the president of Angola, President Lorenzo, visiting the White House. It's very unusual for an African head of state to visit the Oval Office, despite the fact that you have all of this hand-wringing about the Chinese role in Africa. In any case, what happens is that the plan, the diabolical plan of South Africa to squash and squelch Angolan independence did not succeed. And what happens thereafter is that the U.S. administration, and particularly Mr. Kissinger, blamed this on Cuba's allies, speaking of the Soviet Union. He said that Soviet assistance to Cuba was a violation of the rules of détente, this easing of tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States. And so what happens is that Kissinger and his comrades then redouble their efforts to try to undermine the Soviet Union. This brings us to another trip that he was involved in a trip in both senses of the word. That is to say, recall that Mr. Kissinger was essential to the relationship with China, the United States recognizing China 50-odd years ago. The issue was, of course, that China was recognized on an anti-Soviet basis, and that led to massive direct foreign investment into China by U.S. corporations, which has helped to create this juggernaut by 2023. Now, Kissinger's role does not end there. After he leaves the Ford administration, circa 1976, 1977, with his defeat at the hands of Jimmy Carter, Dr. Kissinger sets up a very lucrative consultancy, and he becomes a door opener for the Fortune 500 corporations who want to invest in China. He earns a large fortune opening doors in China. And as a matter of fact, it's said that during his 100 years on Earth, he visited China 100 times, believe it or not, and had access to leaders at the highest level, including President Xi Jinping. And what's remarkable about that is that this was not necessarily unique. This was bipartisan. What I mean is that the former Secretary of State under Bill Clinton, speaking of Madeleine Albright, also interestingly enough, of Eastern European immigrant background, she also set up a lucrative consultancy that was able to capitalize on the foreign policies she shaped and executed under Clinton. And this is the kind of cynicism that has alienated so many of the population of the United States of America as they see officials who are supposedly serving the public interest and then capitalize upon policies that they help to shape. And I would also be remiss if I ignored another bipartisan point, which is that Jimmy Carter, the now sainted Jimmy Carter, carried through with Kissinger-Nixon policies with regard to China in particular. Recall that he helped to engineer the appointment of Leonard Woodcock, a leader of the United Auto Workers. Yes, the United Auto Workers just on strike, to become U.S. ambassador to China at a time when U.S. manufacturers were crossing the Pacific in search of cheap labor in China. And this obviously was helpful to China. The question is, was it helpful to the United Auto Workers? But once again, this is the bloodstained and cynical and tragic legacy of one Henry Kissinger. Now, it's oftentimes said popularly that if you don't have anything good to say about someone after they pass, don't say anything. So as the late comedian Moms Mabley used to say, Dr. Kissinger has passed, good.
You mentioned the bipartisan nature. You mentioned Carter carried through on Kissinger-Nixon policy. And we're going to be talking about the passing of Kissinger throughout this program today, because I think it's more important to talk about the policy than the person, in that the bipartisan nature of it. Henry Kissinger represented and helped to form and shape American foreign policy. Even after he was done being national security advisor and secretary of state, you mentioned Hillary Clinton loved Henry Kissinger. Madeleine Albright loved Henry Kissinger. And Barack Obama loved Henry Kissinger. They're all Democrats. And we make this mistake in terms of trying to think in binary terms. And this has really nothing to do with the commander in chief, with the party of the person sitting in the seat. It has everything to do with American foreign policy. Dr. Horne.
Well, that's certainly the case. And as you know, there's this nostrum in Washington that politics stops at the water's edge. That is to say, there can be quarreling over domestic events, but there should be unity with regard to foreign policy. And I'm afraid to say that some of our friends on the left implicitly have adopted that nostrum insofar as they oftentimes, in a rather simplistic, simple-minded manner, unite with the Democratic Party, but seemingly ignore the foreign policy consequences of that. And now we see the consequences of that with regard to historic Palestine, where you see a Democratic president shipping arms across the seas to war criminals in Israel. And it comes with ill grace for our friends on the left to say, well, this is the price we pay for aligning with the Democrats, because it obviously is a very stiff price for the Palestinian people in particular. And that brings me to the remarkable op-ed that appeared in the New York Times just the other day by Senate Majority Leader and Democrat Chuck Schumer, and of course being echoed by Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, who has not called for a ceasefire. Senator Schumer, rather remarkably, talked about how the Zionist lobby, the Israeli lobby in the United States, they feel, quote, alone, unquote. Mm-hmm. Alone? Interestingly, he chose that particular term, despite the fact that their policies are being backed by the White House, by a good deal of the capitalist world, that is to say, by the Federal Republic of Germany in particular. And I'm scratching my head trying to figure out what he meant by that. Is he suggesting that unless there's unanimity of opinion, the Zionist lobby feels alone? And what's remarkable about that is that that's not the opinion of Senator Schumer alone. Just a few weeks ago, if you check, you'll find a column by the hard-nosed New York Times columnist Bret Stephens, who uses the same term, saying how the Zionist supporters in the United States feel, quote, alone, unquote. I'm trying to figure out what they mean by that. But what I think that they should be paying attention to is what many of them are ignoring. For example, the purpose of Senator Schumer's op-ed was to rebuke and reprimand forces on the left who he feels are insufficiently supportive of Israeli war criminals. But at the same time, he was making that statement on the floor of the Senate and penning that op-ed in the New York Times. You had a similarly remarkable op-ed that appeared in the Wall Street Journal, where in attempting to defend Elon Musk, the billionaire, who, as you know, on his platform X, also known as Twitter, endorsed a notoriously anti-Jewish statement by some random poster, and then engaged in performative penance by going to Israel and breaking bread with Mr. Netanyahu himself. The writer in the Wall Street Journal then assailed the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, a major component of the Israeli lobby in the United States, and a major target of Elon Musk too, by the way. And he used the term, quote, identitarian, unquote, to apply and to affix to the ADL. Now, for those not in the know, that is a descriptor that's ordinarily used to help to discredit black folk. Black Lives Matter is identitarian. That is to say that it should not be taken seriously. The folks like Senator Schumer should recognize that they may be in deeper water than they realize when you have the Wall Street Journal affixing labels to the ADL that are ordinarily affixed to black folk that they want to discredit. This suggests that Senator Schumer should have better spent his time on the Senate floor and in the New York Times. Instead of rebuking and reprimanding those to his left, he should be paying more careful and close attention to those on the right. Because what's happening now is that, as the press has reliably reported, there are growing fissures and rifts in the U.S. ruling class about this Palestine policy, not least because, as we speak, there is a sweeping boycott that is being engineered in the West Asia region and in places like Istanbul. You might have seen the video, for example, of a protester, a pro-Palestinian protester in Istanbul, releasing mice in a McDonald's franchise in Istanbul, sending customers scaring hither and yon. You have Starbucks that are sitting empty because people refuse to patronize this emblem of U.S. imperialism. And there is a danger, according to some, that this boycott of U.S. Fortune 500 corporations could spread like wildfire, leaving U.S. imperialism in a very ticklish position. Should they continue to support the depredations of the war criminals in Israel, or should they seek to try to walk away from Israel without saying they're doing so? In other words, what they're doing in Ukraine, to try to pull the rug out from under the regime while acting like you're not doing so, or in other words, to pat them on the back with one hand and sort of pick their pocket with the other hand. That is the rather ticklish dilemma faced by U.S. imperialism, which in many ways is a direct product and outcome of the cynical and opportunistic policies basically engineered by the late Henry Kissinger, who is now being celebrated, although I dare say that in the larger scheme of things, when history is finally written in an accurate and adequate manner, he will be demonized, as he well should be.
We have just about a minute and a half left, and I want to go back to Schumer on the floor of the Senate. He said that because many of the incidents targeting Jewish people have come alongside left-wing demonstrations against Israel, liberal Jewish people are feeling singled, targeted, and isolated. He specifically called out the phrase "from the river to the sea," saying it alarms Jewish people to hear it used. I see a couple of holes in his logic. First of all, he seems to be very subtly, or maybe not so subtly, blaming the left and their support of Palestine for the plight of Jewish people and the reaction of Jewish people in this country. He and others like Tony Blinken are conflating or equating opposition to genocide to anti-Semitism. And these two things are not related. But they continue to want to try to make them related as leverage against those who are in support of freedom and those that are against the genocidal acts of the occupying forces against those being occupied. I could go on, but quickly, your thoughts.
Well, let's face it. Mr. Schumer has presented an argument that is full of holes as a block of Swiss cheese. He should be paying more attention to, as I've already suggested, to these malevolent forces on the right who are determined, it seems to me, to not only engineer a wave of anti-Jewish fervor, as evidenced by the antics of one Elon Musk, but also are the folks who actually wield the real power, not Jewish Voices for Peace, not Students for Justice in Palestine. And in any case, I had thought that when people join Black Lives Matter protests and the like, that it's not seen as transactional. I assume that they're joining the protests because they object to Black people being shot down like dogs in the street.
Okay.
For engaging in civil actions.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis. I look forward to having you back.